Japan is full of history, both factual and mythological, and we want to share these stories with you. And we'll be jumping around the history of Japan to find stories both interesting and fantastical. I'm your host, Thomas.
And I'm your co-host, Heather. We've both lived in Japan now for over 2 years and have learned so many interesting tales to tell. We'll also be reading a Japanese song or poem for you in Japanese, and we'll discuss the poet and meaning behind these songs.
And with that out the way, Heather, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, let's go. Hi guys, it's Thomas. We just wanted to say please continue to listen after we've signed off on this episode and said our goodbyes. I managed the other day to visit a museum dedicated to the man we're going to talk about in today's episode, and I found out more information there which I wanted to add to the end of this episode 8. There are a few things that Heather would also like to say in addition to our original recording. Once again, thank you for tuning in to today's episode.
You know what? Let's just do the two-parter. Let's do it. Let's just do it. I'm going to say let's just do it. I am all ready to go.
Cool. Okay. This is Japan Archives episode 8A, Righteous Among Nations. This is the first of a two-part episode looking into the lives of 3 different people during the Second World War. And basically we wanted to do this as the anniversary of the atomic bomb is soon to come around, the bombs which were dropped on August 6th and August 9th. So we just wanted to cover this topic briefly, as well as look at the lives of a few other people and their actions during the Second World War. So today we're going to do a bit different to usual. I think we have our story to tell, but we split it up, so me and Heather will be taking you through different parts of the story. There'll probably be less questions, or if there are, they'll be towards the end of the episode, but that's just a heads up. So today we wanted to share the story of a man called Chiune Sugihara, and it's a story that we both learned while we were in Japan. At least for me, before I'd come to Japan, I'd never heard of the man, but I think what he did was very admirable. So Chiune was born the 1st of January 1900, eventually dying on the 31st of July 1986, and he was born in Gifu Prefecture. Now, for those who know about Japan, they obviously have a different dating system to us. So the 1900s, when he was born, would equate to the 33rd year of the Meiji period. Chiune was the second son of a man called Yoshima and his wife called Yatsu, and he was one of 5 brothers, and he also had 1 sister, so it was quite a big family, especially for a Japanese household when you compare it to like today, where the families are quite a lot smaller. Now, he and his family lived in a borrowed temple close to the temple of Kosenji, which was a Buddhist temple. As he grew up, he moved to many different elementary schools at the time, but in December 1907, he finally transferred to the Nagoya Municipal Furuwatari Elementary School, where he finally graduated with honors. After that, he moved to the Aichi Prefectural Secondary School, which was a combined school for both junior high and high school students. He stayed there and eventually graduated.
As he was growing up, his father wanted him to become a physician, but Chiune didn't share his father's ideas. He actually failed his entrance exam for the course. He only wrote his name. In 1918, which is Taisho Era 7, he entered Waseda University, where he studied to major in English. To help improve his English, he also went into a Christian fraternity founded by a Baptist pastor. And then in 1919, he finished the Foreign Ministry Scholarship exam.
So Chiune now has finished his education, at least for the time being, and so he joins the Japanese Imperial Army, and there he was a second lieutenant from 1920 to 1922. While he held this position in the army, he was stationed in Korea, which at the time was still a Japanese colony.
So time passes, and he's now serving in the Manchurian Foreign Office. And if you're wondering what Manchuria is, it's the term coined by the Japanese to cover a large area of Northeast Asia. which could be said to encompass large sections of China and Russia. During his time here, he was in the negotiations with the Soviet Union about the Northern Manchurian Railroad. During this time, he married for the first time. He converted to Christianity and married a woman called Claudia Apollonova. He took on a baptized name for his marriage, which was Sergei Pavlovich. But by 1935, he quit his post. He disagreed with the mistreatment of the local Chinese in the area. This mistreatment was being caused by the other Japanese who were overseeing the people in this area. He then divorced Claudia and returned to Japan. While in Japan, he married his second wife, Yukiko Kikuchi, and together they had 4 sons. So he had a large family and he was part of a large family. So it looks like he kept on that tradition of having a large family.
So, as quite a lot of you might know, World War II began on September 1st, 1939, which was the same year that Chiune was also moved to Lithuania, the city of Kaunas, where he was sent to work. His role there was to basically keep tabs on the Soviet and German troops' movements at the time and relay any plans that the Germans may have had to attack the Soviets to his superiors in both Berlin and Tokyo. 1940 finally rolls around, and the Soviet Union then occupies the country of Lithuania where he is living. And as we know, the Second World War was a very dangerous time for many groups, including Jews, minorities, homosexuals, and many others. But what made it more dangerous, at least in Lithuania, was that Jewish people made up a third of the urban population. So there was a lot bigger Jewish community that could potentially, they were no longer safe. They could potentially lose their lives. And they all wanted to leave. They were all desperate for exit visas, but sadly and unfortunately at the time, it was virtually impossible to find someone or even a country that was willing to issue them to you so that you could escape and find freedom or even just safety. In the end, hundreds and hundreds of Jewish men and women, bringing their entire families, they came to the city of Kaunas, where Chiune was, desperately trying to seek visas that could take them to Japan. And Chiune, seeing their desperations, knowing that they were unsafe, Chiune obviously, seeing these desperate people, he wants to help. And, he doesn't want to see these people die or suffer, and he feels that he can't leave them stranded. So he contacts the foreign ministry in Japan, basically asking how he can help these people and how he can give them their own visas. But every time he asks, Japan basically tells him no, that these people who aren't safe, that these people who could die, did not fit a criteria to make them worthy of being given a visa. And the ministry told him that basically these people needed to have money and that they had to have already undergone appropriate immigration procedures, which obviously they would have never have done because until this point they had no need to emigrate from this country. But they also demanded that in addition to having this visa that would allow them to go to Japan, they would need an extra visa so that once in Japan they could immediately leave and move on to a third country where they would reside in safety. And the ministry basically said that they would not make an exception to these rules, basically in a way refusing to give any visas to these people so that they may help them find safety.
So at this point, Chiune, who wanted to help, he did the only thing that he knew to do. He disobeyed. He went against his orders, which for Japanese people is very, very rare and unheard of. And during this time as well, even more so, there's a very strong sense of, following along with what you're told and in society. And this was really difficult for him to do, but he did it. So July 18th, 1940, he started to write his visas. So he wrote 10-day visas, which would give all these people safe passage to Japan. The passage would be through the Trans-Siberian Railway, though it did have a cost. And not just that, but the Soviets also demanded that these people pay 5 times the normal amount of a ticket if they truly wanted to leave. Chiune handwrote these 10-day visas, from 18 to 20 hours a day. Each day he wrote a month's worth of visas, and didn't stop until the 4th of September. At this point, he had written thousands of visas that would allow people to reach safety. At times, he even ensured that he was giving these visas to the head of the household because it would allow and permit them to take their families with them. Chiune was reassigned to Königsberg in East Prussia. Some reports state he left his consulate seat so other people could make more visas after he left, though his son in a later interview stated this to be false. Others report he continued to write visas even while he was leaving and making his way to his hotel, handing them out as he left. And then, while he was boarding the train at Kaunas station, he continued to write on the train as many as he could, throwing them out the window to those who were still desperate to leave. And as the train left, in desperation, he merely made sheets with his seal and signature to throw from the train, which hopefully could have the rest of the visas written upon later. The last thing he did as he left was apologize he couldn't do more, saying, "Please forgive me. I cannot write more. I wish you the best." It's said someone could be heard saying, "We'll never forget you. I'll surely see you again." Chiune had done everything he could for these people.
Now, it's worth mentioning that during the Second World War, between 91% and 95% of the Jewish population in Lithuania were killed, which, when you count it up, is pretty much every single Jew who could not find an exit visa to leave the country. And in actuality, it is the highest casualty rate of any nation that was subjected to the Holocaust. It also turned out that Chiune was also responsible for saving the Mir Yeshiva. Now, a yeshiva was a Jewish educational institute with a focus on studying traditional religious texts such as the Talmud and the Torah. And this was the only European yeshiva which survived the Holocaust because of Chiune's intervention. And this educational institute eventually found its way to Kobe, where it actually stayed for a while. It remained there for some time until years later, Japan then decided to themselves expel all Jews from mainland Japan. And so the yeshiva had to move again and finally found its way to Shanghai. In total, it is debated how many Jews Chiune actually managed to save. Some reports would say 6,000, some would even go as high as 10,000. And of course, it's difficult to figure out a total amount when you consider that he could give out one visa, which would ensure the safety of an entire family. However, recently, me and Heather, while we were doing our research for Chiune, found that there is actually a museum around the corner from Tokyo Station. And the museum itself lists all their survivors, all the people who received life-saving visas, and that list totals 2,139 names in total.
So returning back to the story, Chiune and his family were stationed in East Prussia, but by 1944, Soviet troops invaded. He and his family were interned in a POW camp, and they stayed there for 18 months. Eventually, they were released in 1946, and they returned to Japan. The following year, he was asked to resign. Now, some sources would say it was because the Japan Foreign Office was downsizing, but there are other sources, and even his wife says that he was asked to resign due to that incident in Lithuania.
Now, it wasn't until over 2 decades later, in 1969, that people then began lobbying for Chiune's recognition for what he did to save all those Jewish lives. And the following year, in 1970, he was finally given this recognition and received the title Righteous Among the Nations. But sadly, at the time, he was too ill to travel and so couldn't go to collect the award for himself. But luckily, his wife and his youngest son, Nobuki, went on his behalf. And eventually, in 1985, he was asked for his reasons for why he did what he did, why he went against the Japanese ministry, and why he decided to save all these Jewish people. And his response was as follows.
You want to know about my motivation, don't you? Well, It is the kind of sentiments anyone would have when he actually sees refugees face to face, begging with tears in their eyes. He just cannot help but sympathize with them. Among the refugees were the elderly and women. They were so desperate that they went so far as to kiss my shoes. Yes, I actually witnessed such scenes with my own eyes. Also, I felt at that time that the Japanese government did not have any uniform opinion in Tokyo. Some Japanese military leaders were just scared because of the pressure from the Nazis, while others in the Home Ministry were simply ambivalent. People in Tokyo were not united. I felt it silly to deal with them, so I made up my mind not to wait for their reply. I knew that somebody would surely complain about me in the future, but I myself thought this would be the right thing to do. There is nothing wrong in saving many people's lives. The spirit of humanity, philanthropy, neighborly friendship. With this spirit, I ventured to do what I did, confronting this most difficult situation, and because of this reason, I went ahead with redoubled courage.
Eventually, Chiune died the following year, actually, on the 31st of July, 1986. And actually, in spite of the publicity given to him in Israel and other nations at the time, he remained virtually unknown in his country for, quite a long time. And it was only when a large Jewish delegation from around the world, including the Israel ambassador to Japan, actually attended his funeral, that his neighbors actually found out what he'd done. So, despite everything he had done for these people, he never told anyone else in Japan actually what he did to save the lives of all these people.
It's such a powerful story. I'm trying to think about what to say, but it's really an inspiring story that someone who knew he was doing something that went against his orders and knew he wasn't going to get, recognition and praise, but he did it anyway.
And I think as well, like you were saying, that the fact that he did disobey and the fact that he was Japanese shows how convicted he was in saving these people's lives. Because as we know, in Japan, it's very difficult. If people will do as they're told, they will not go against their orders or their requests from their superiors. So for the fact that he actually did it is very, very admirable.
It took a lot of courage. I mean, it's, sometimes talking about another culture, you don't want to look at it in terms of your own culture. So you have to sometimes, it's a very interesting position to be in. Like, you have to look at another culture, not just through the lens of your culture, but to think about it in terms of being in that separate culture. And one of the things that's nice about Japan is the social harmony, that people do help each other, but some of the things that aren't as positive is that if you have orders, you follow them and do what you're told, and you don't want to be the nail that gets hammered down. So it's so hard to, to say, just coming from a different culture, but yeah, for him to do something that just was really not part of his culture, to go outside and say, nope, this is wrong, I'm going to do it, I'm going to help people. It's so beautiful and powerful. The first time I read it was in a Japanese newspaper that had been translated into English, and that was the first time I had encountered the story. And I was just amazed when I read it. I had no idea. I mean, that's the thing, there's so many stories from this time, from this era, and we don't get to hear all of them. And I think telling this story it's a good thing. It's a good thing to do. It's a good time to tell this story. It's hope. There's hope in this story.
I definitely found the story interesting, and I know that you did too. And I hope that everyone listening also found it interesting. And that is very much a summarized account of Chiune's life. We just wanted to bring to you his exploits and show you what he did to protect the lives of so many Jews during the Second World War. But now that is over, as per tradition, I think it's time for Heather's poem. Now, is the poem today, Heather, a little cheerier than the story we just told, or?
So the poem I chose this week relates to the story, I believe. So I still kept along with the spirit of the story. So I'm sorry it's not quite as cheerful, but I think it's a beautiful poem. So if you're ready, I'll go ahead and read it.
Well, first, tell me who it's by.
Oh my gosh, yes, I can do that. It's Yamanoue no Okura, and this is a haiku. And he was a bureaucrat. So he was born in a poor family, but he was promoted to this position of bureaucrat, which at the time, during the 8th century, was not quite so common. If you were born into a poor family, you usually stayed poor. You weren't elevated so much above your station. He was actually appointed a bureaucrat in China, and then during the Tang Dynasty, he got the viewpoint of all the people he talked to. It was inspired and influenced from all of the viewpoints he got to write his poems. And his poems have according to the professor, have a more journalistic feel to them.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm ready for the poem then.
Okay. 世の中を牛と優しいと思えども、飛び立ちかなつ。And the translation this week, I did something a little different. I encountered a quote recently that from Robert Frost is poetry is what's lost in translation. So I think we've mentioned before about the translation sometimes being a little bit different, and it could influence how you feel about the poem. Well, I asked the professor this week to help me. I wanted the translation from him. It's a little bit different from the translation I saw on a few different places. So the translation from the professor is, even if this world is full of pain or easy, it doesn't matter. I can't help staying here. I am not a bird at all.
Okay, so basically it's a poem about, it doesn't matter what circumstances you're living in, you have to live and work through it. You can't escape as a bird would. You can't just fly away from your problems, so you have to stand up and deal with them. At least that is what I would interpret it as meaning.
It's interesting because the translation that the professor told me is that full of pain or easy. So even if your life is very hard or difficult, or even if it's boring and nothing goes on, it doesn't matter, which is kind of unusual. The translations I saw said mostly full of pain and suffering. It didn't have that sort of easy part to it. So, but yeah, you're right. No matter what, you're here. You can't fly away. You have to stay here and look at your problems, even if they're difficult or they're easy.
Oh, I was wondering where this poem came from. Which book of poetry you found this in?
Well, it is actually from the Manyoshu, which we have had before on the show.
Oh, okay.
And Thomas, weren't you telling me something interesting about the Manyoshu that you discovered?
We were doing a little bit of research on poetry together the other day. I was on the train coming back from the beach at Kamakura, and I found out that there are several botanical gardens set up around Japan, which on the whole have planted in them all the plants and the trees that are mentioned in all these Manyoshu poems, and they are all called the Manu Botanical Gardens. And actually I found out there is one in Tokyo. So my plan is to go get some pictures for our listeners to look at.
I am definitely looking forward to that. I can't wait to see the pictures too. And I hope it'll be lovely and peaceful and beautiful for you.
So yeah, I think that might have done it for us for today. What about you? Do you have anything else to say, or?
I think today, I think I'm good.
Okay. I just want to say again, thank you to everyone who listens to this episode. It's not as cheery as other episodes, and it's slightly different. There wasn't as much of the question and answer session that we've developed, but it was a story we wanted to tell you, and we hope you enjoyed it. So again, thank you for listening.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we really hope that we were able to share this story in a way that is hopeful and respectful. And we want everyone to know and listen and share And just thank you, everyone, for listening. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, guys. Once again, thank you for listening to this week's episode. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Hey again, it's Thomas. Like we said, I managed to find some time to go to the Sempo Museum close to Tokyo Station. It's a small museum dedicated to Mr. Sugihara, and I wanted to give a few more details about what we have covered. First of all, the reason that Chiune was sent to Kaunas in the first place was to open and establish a new consulate in that city. And later on, the Soviets systematically closed the embassies in Lithuania, meaning that in the end, only the Japanese one remained, which was why so many came from afar to this particular one. We also have a quote from Mr. Sugihara about his feelings when the embassy said no to him when he wished to give visas for the Jews asking for help. And in the end, his thoughts were as follows. Would it be reasonable to deny the visa applications on the thought of insufficient travel documentation, security, or other reasons, earning the eternal resentment of the Jewish people with their worldwide support base, watching them die solely to the whims of a shallow, irresponsible, and reckless military group seeking only to conform with the Nazi alliance? Would that truly meet our national interest? After much struggle, I ultimately reached the conclusion that humanity and compassion comes first. With my wife's agreement, I faithfully executed that mission. I also want to say that we found out that most of the Jews that Mr. Sugihara actually saved were of Polish descent, who had fled into Lithuania after Hitler and the Soviets had taken over Poland during World War II. And we also talked about the visas and how they gave all these people a passage out of the country via the Trans-Siberian Railway. But these people still had one more hurdle to overcome, and that was when their journey on the train ended, they still needed to board a ship to Japan. Here they needed permission from the acting consul at the time by the name of Saburo Nei, and he himself knew that he had to refuse entry to these people, as Japan did not wish. Well, Japan had established rules that basically made it almost impossible for these people to have official visas. Now, he managed to get around these rules by reasoning and stating that for these people to have visas in the first place, it must mean that they had received them from an official who represented the wishes of the ministry, and through that reasoning and logic, he allowed these people a safe passage into Japan. And Saburo was also a friend for many years of Mr. Sugihara. And one final thing, prior to people lobbying for the recognition of what Mr. Sugihara had done, he had visited the Israel consulate where he met a man who now also worked there. And this man at the time presented Sugihara with a document, and the document itself had his own handwriting and his official seal, and he was one of the men who he had saved during the Second World War, and this man had basically always kept with him the visa that had saved his life. That is everything else that I found out at the museum, and I really do hope that you feel we did justice to the actions of this man in today's episode. Like we said, it's a very different episode to what we've done before, but still we hope you found it interesting to learn about this aspect of history. And with that, I'll hand over to Heather.
Several days later, all I can think is I did not do justice to this story. We recorded this podcast twice. The first time, we stopped at the beginning and decided to change the telling. We recorded the next day in the new style that you heard on this podcast. It's so important that more people hear about this event, now more than ever. And it needs to be told over and over again. When I first read this story, I was amazed. It's rare for most people to defy orders, but it's even more difficult for someone that comes from a culture that thrives on social harmony. Mr. Sugihara did what was right and just. Speaking for myself, sometimes words failed me while presenting this podcast. However, when you hear this podcast, I hope you will listen to the events regardless of the storyteller. Please know that we truly honor and respect Mr. Sugihara's life and work, and that we did our best to convey them to you. Mr. Sugihara, thank you. Thank you for what you did several years ago, and may it inspire others today to help in ways both great and small.
If you enjoy the Japan Archives and have an interest in Japanese history and mythology, please be sure to check out our growing database over at historyofjapan.co.uk. We continue to add more to it every week, and you can find the show notes for every episode up on the website too. It's a large undertaking, so please be patient while we try to make a database which all Japanese history lovers can find useful. You can find us over on Twitter at A History of Japan, and if you're on Instagram, you can find us there at nexus_travels. That's NEXUS_travels.
We also have a Facebook page, which you can find at Japan Archives. All of our social media is different. Also, if you're interested in little slices of life in Japan, be sure to check out my website over at heatheroveryonder.com. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, or have anything you'd love to hear about, head on over to historyofjapan.co.uk and send us a message.
If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to give us a rating and review over on iTunes. Right now, it's the best place to do so, and it helps us get the word out about this show. Thanks again for listening, guys. Until next time, bye.
またね。